The man who slept outside the bakery every night never asked for more than leftover bread. He never begged, never made a scene, just sat quietly on the same bench, under the same flickering street lamp, night after night. Months later, he stood at a podium in front of city officials and reporters and announced that he owned the entire block, including the shelter that was supposed to be helping him. Hannah Reyes had worked the closing shift at Magnolia Bakery in East Nashville for 2 years, ever since the divorce had made every dollar count twice. She was 27, raising her son Ben mostly alone, and had learned to treat exhaustion as background noise rather than something worth mentioning out loud. Her days started at 6 when she dropped Ben at her sister's place before school and usually ended past 9, once the bakery's display case had been wiped down and the next morning's dough was already proofing in the walk-in. Most evenings followed the same shape: closing checklist, register count the particular quiet of a bakery after the ovens cooled, then a tired drive home with the radio low so it wouldn't wake Ben if he'd fallen asleep waiting up. It wasn't a hard life by the standards she'd grown up watching her own mother survive, but it left very little room for anything unplanned: a flat tire, a sick day, a $40 field trip fee, without some other corner of the budget quietly giving way to cover it. The bakery sat on a corner that had been slowly gentrifying for years. New coffee shops and yoga studios pushing up against older buildings that hadn't changed much since the 80s. One of those older buildings, 2 doors down, was Cornerstone Shelter, a transitional housing facility that always seemed to have more donors than beds, at least according to the glossy newsletter that showed up in Hannah's mailbox twice a year, asking for contributions she genuinely couldn't afford to give. It was outside that same building, on a bench that technically belonged to the shelter's small courtyard, that Hannah first noticed the man everyone else seemed determined not to see. He'd been there for about 2 weeks before she really registered him. A tall man, maybe early 40s, with a beard that looked more neglected than intentional, and the kind of stillness people mistake for danger when it's really just exhaustion. He kept a single canvas bag beside him and rarely spoke to anyone, including the shelter staff who passed him on their way in and out without acknowledgement, the way you might walk past a piece of furniture you'd stopped noticing. What Hannah didn't know was that the man's name was Marcus Hale, and that he wasn't actually homeless in the way the rest of the block assumed. Not in the sense of having nowhere else to go, anyway. Marcus owned Hale Group, the development company that had quietly funded Cornerstone Shelter for the past 6 years as part of a community investment initiative tied to his company's other properties on the block. 2 months earlier, an anonymous letter had reached his office, written by someone who'd once stayed at Cornerstone, and described conditions that didn't match a single line of the glowing annual reports Marcus's team kept presenting to him. Beds reported as available that were never actually open. Meal counts that didn't match food orders. A director, Patricia Connors, whose numbers always looked perfect and whose actual shelter, according to the letter, often didn't. Marcus had asked his board for time to look into it personally. They'd told him to send an auditor. He'd done something far less reasonable instead. He'd taken an unannounced leave, let his beard grow out, packed a single bag, and gone to find out what his own funded shelter actually looked like from outside its front doors, under a name nobody would recognize. Just Sam, no last name needed, when you slept on a public bench. He had not expected the experience to be quite this isolating. He had also not expected the first person to treat him like he existed to be a bakery clerk closing up 2 doors down, who one evening walked over holding a paper bag without being asked. "We're closing in 10 minutes, Hannah said, "and everything in here gets thrown out if nobody takes it. Seems like a waste." She held the bag out. "There's a few day-old croissants and half a loaf of sourdough. Not exactly a feast, but it's not stale yet either." Marcus, Sam, for now, looked at the bag for a moment longer than necessary, the way people look at things they've stopped expecting. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more than the 2 words usually carried. "Don't thank me. Thank the bakery's terrible inventory management," Hannah said, already turning to go. "Same time tomorrow if there's extra." He watched her walk back inside, the bell over the door giving its small, ordinary chime, and for a moment he simply stood there holding the bag, recalibrating something he couldn't yet name. There usually was. Over the following weeks, the paper bag became a small, quiet ritual. Bread, sometimes a pastry that hadn't sold, occasionally a thermos of coffee Hannah brought from home because the bakery's evening pot was always burnt by closing. She never asked him questions he didn't volunteer answers to. She learned, in fragments, that he'd worked in business once, that he was new to actually being on this side of the street, that he noticed things most people on the block didn't. Which bus was always late, which shelter staff member always seemed too tired to make eye contact, which donors' names got mentioned in conversation more than the people the donations were supposedly for. Some nights he talked more than others. He told her once that the strangest part wasn't the cold or the discomfort of the bench, but the specific experience of being looked through rather than at, as if visibility itself were a privilege he'd never noticed he'd been spending freely his whole life until it was suddenly gone. Hannah didn't have a tidy response to that. She just kept bringing the bag the next night and the night after, because some things didn't need a response so much as a continuation. The trouble started on a Thursday evening when a man in an expensive jacket, clearly annoyed about something unrelated to the bakery, snapped at Sam for loitering near the entrance while he waited for Hannah's shift to end. "This corner's gone downhill since they let people like you camp out here," he said, loud enough to draw a few glances from passers-by. "Somebody should call someone." Sam said nothing, the particular silence of someone who'd learned, fast, that arguing rarely improved anything. Hannah, walking out with the paper bag already in hand, did not stay silent. "He's not camping out, he's sitting on a public bench, which is legal, last I checked," she said. "Maybe direct the complaint at city zoning, not a guy minding his own business." The man's jaw tightened. He didn't apologize. He simply walked into the bakery and asked, pointedly, for the manager. Greg Sanders, who ran the bakery's evening operations and had been looking for a reason to tighten loss control for weeks, used the complaint as exactly the excuse he needed. He pulled Hannah aside the next morning, in front of 2 other staff, and told her that giving away store inventory to transients was theft, that customers had complained about the bakery's image, and that she was let go, effective immediately. The man in the expensive jacket, whose rudeness had started the whole thing, was never mentioned again. Sam, technically trespassing on private courtyard property he'd been quietly allowed to sit on for weeks, was asked to leave the block entirely by a security guard who worked, ironically, for a company Marcus's own firm contracted. Hannah drove home that day in a kind of numb quiet, the specific exhaustion of losing something for doing the one thing that had actually felt right in a long time. She picked Ben up from her sister's, made dinner out of whatever was left in the fridge, and didn't see Sam again for almost 3 weeks, mostly because there was nowhere left for him to be seen. What she didn't know was that Marcus had spent those 3 weeks finishing what he'd actually come to do, quietly documenting empty beds reported as full, meal logs that didn't match deliveries, and a pattern of donor funds routed through Patricia Connor's personal consulting fees. He surfaced at a previously scheduled city council meeting on shelter funding, stepping up to the podium in a suit that fit him properly for the first time in months, beard trimmed, the unmistakable bearing of a man used to being listened to. "Some of you may not recognize me without the beard," he said, and a low murmur moved through the room. "My name is Marcus Hale. I own Hale Group, which funds Cornerstone Shelter 2 doors down from where I've spent the last several weeks, sleeping outside it under the name Sam." The room went still in the way rooms go still when something doesn't make sense yet. He laid out the discrepancies plainly. The false bed counts, the meal logs, the donor money that should have built more capacity and instead built Patricia Connor's consulting income. "I learned more about how that shelter actually runs in 2 months on a bench outside it than I did in 6 years funding it from a boardroom," he said. "And I learned that the people on that block see far more than anyone gives them credit for." He paused. "Including a bakery clerk named Hannah Reyes, who fed a stranger every night without knowing or caring who he really was, and who lost her job for defending him from a man who never once apologized. Patricia Connors, seated near the front, went visibly pale. Marcus found Hannah 2 days later, at her sister's apartment dressed in clothes that fit him, and a face she barely recognized without the beard's full weight on it. "You could have told me," she said, arms crossed, somewhere between stunned and angry. "I couldn't. Not without compromising the whole reason I was there," he said. "My name is Marcus Hale. I fund the shelter you live 2 doors down from. I went undercover because I stopped trusting the reports I was being given about what was actually happening inside it." He exhaled. "I'd like to offer you a job. Community outreach lead for the shelter's restructuring. Better pay, real hours, and a real say in how the place is actually run." "Why me?" "Because you didn't know who I was, and you fed me anyway. That's not something I can repay with a paycheck. I can only try to deserve it." She took the job mostly because turning it down out of pride wouldn't have paid her sister back for 3 weeks of borrowed grocery money. The following months were strange in ways neither of them expected. Marcus Hale, it turned out, had brought several habits back with him from the bench that refused to leave even after his bank account no longer required them. He still scraped every plate clean without thinking about it, still flinched slightly at the sight of food being thrown away, still sat out of old instinct on public benches longer than any meeting agenda required. He fumbled, almost endearingly, with the small machinery of an ordinary life he'd skipped for years. Laundry, grocery self-checkouts, the particular etiquette of a crowded city bus. All things Hannah had never stopped doing, and he was only now relearning properly. Ben, who had met Sam exactly twice on the bench before everything changed, decided early that Marcus's defining trait was the guy who gives his fries away even when nobody's hungry, which struck Hannah as more accurate than anything in his company's annual report. Marcus came by most weeks, sometimes to help Ben with homework at the kitchen table with the careful seriousness of a man treating multiplication tables like a quarterly report, sometimes just to sit with Hannah after Ben was asleep, talking about the parts of his life nobody at Hale Group ever asked about. The loneliness of inheriting a company at 25, the strange shame of being trusted with millions, and unable to explain, even to himself, why it had taken 3 weeks on a bench to actually see his own shelter clearly. Hannah, in turn, told him about her ex-husband, about the particular math of raising a child on a bakery clerk's wage, about the dignity she'd always tried to give people on that block, even when nobody gave it back. Marcus listened the way she'd noticed he did most things now. Slowly, without rushing toward a fix, like the listening itself mattered more than whatever came after it. One Saturday, Jenny, Hannah's old co-worker from the bakery, who'd kept texting her updates about Greg's increasingly chaotic attempts to replace her, invited herself along to see the famous Marcus Hale in person finally, and arrived at the shelter's courtyard with the subtlety of someone who had already decided this was the most interesting thing to happen on the block in years. She found Marcus crouched by a row of donated planters, carefully untangling a snarled garden hose with the focused intensity most people reserved for actual emergencies. "So this is the billionaire," Jenny said, arms crossed, clearly delighted, "fighting a hose." "It looped on itself," Marcus said without looking up. "It's a solvable problem. Everything's a solvable problem to rich people. That's sort of the issue." But she was smiling when she said it, and by the time the hose was untangled, Jenny had decided, loudly and without much room for debate, that he'd do. Ben spent the afternoon supervising by counting flower pots out loud and occasionally announcing the wrong total with total confidence, while Marcus nodded along as if the math checked out perfectly every time. Afterward, the 3 of them, 4, counting Jenny, who refused to leave before getting the full story, sat on the courtyard steps eating gas station popsicles because nobody had thought to bring anything better. "This is genuinely the best part of my week," Marcus admitted, purple popsicle stain already creeping toward his collar. And I technically run a company with assets in 4 states. Maybe that's the problem, Hannah said. Nobody who runs anything that big usually ends up on a curb with a melting popsicle. He didn't have a quick answer for that one. He just looked at her a beat too long, long enough that Jenny caught it, raised an eyebrow at Hannah behind his back, and mouthed something neither of them bothered to pretend they hadn't seen. The trouble arrived through a door neither of them had been watching. A business outlet ran a story. Billionaires, homelessness stunt, bold reform, or privileged performance. Framing the entire undercover investigation as theater rather than accountability. A second story followed, this one aimed squarely at Hannah. Bakery clerk fired, then hired by the CEO she fed. Convenient timing? Comments beneath both pieces assumed with total confidence that Hannah had recognized Marcus from the start and played the moment for a payday. Patricia Connors, fighting to salvage her own reputation before the audit findings went public, gave a quote suggesting Hannah had selectively fed certain people on the block to curry favor. A claim with no basis beyond Patricia's own need for a distraction. Ben came home from school upset because a classmate had repeated something a parent had read online about his mom's fake job. Hannah's new co-workers at the shelter went quiet around her in the way people go quiet when they're recalculating whether you actually earned your seat at the table. One former resident who'd once thanked Hannah personally for helping push through a bed reassignment left a comment online calling the whole story "rich people cosplaying as homeless for headlines." A line that stung precisely because part of Hannah privately worried it wasn't entirely wrong. Jenny, for her part, found the entire spectacle infuriating in a way she didn't try to hide. "You fed a man bread for 2 months before any of this," she told Hannah over the phone. "Nobody online was there for that part. They just showed up for the part with cameras." It didn't fix anything, but it was, for a few minutes, the only thing anyone had said all week that didn't require Hannah to defend herself. Beneath all of it sat the question Hannah had been avoiding. Had any of the past few months, the homework at her kitchen table, the careful relearning of ordinary life, the late conversations after Ben fell asleep, actually been about her, or had she simply become a useful character in someone else's redemption story? She stopped returning his calls for nearly a week. When he finally found her outside the shelter's new community room, freshly painted, still smelling faintly of primer, she didn't soften the question. "Was any of it real?" she said. "Or was I just the moment that made your story land?" Marcus didn't reach for a polished answer. "I didn't start caring about you because you fed me on a bench," he said. "That told me you were decent. It didn't tell me you'd help Ben with fractions until 10 at night, or that you'd never once asked me for anything since I offered you the job, or that you still save the good bread for whoever needs it most, paycheck or not." He paused. "I know how this looks. A rich man playing rescuer, a woman playing along. But you never once treated me like the man on the bench or the man who owns the block. You treated me like a person both times. That's rarer than almost anything I've found in 6 years of running this company." "That doesn't undo what people are saying about me," Hannah said, voice tight. "No," he agreed. "So I'll fix that part separately, without making it about us." He gave a second public statement 2 days later, alone, without using Hannah's name. He confirmed the full audit findings, accepted responsibility for not investigating the shelter sooner, announced an independent oversight board including former shelter residents, and addressed the speculation directly. Anyone hired during this transition went through the same review process as any other employee. "I won't discuss private relationships in a public statement, and I'd ask reporters to extend the same privacy to my staff that they'd want for themselves." Patricia Connors was formally removed from her position the same week, with the city's own auditor confirming every discrepancy Marcus had documented from the bench. He also quietly arranged a settlement fund for residents whose bed assignments had been falsified in Patricia's reports, a detail his communications team wanted highlighted in the statement, and one he refused to mention publicly at all, on the grounds that it wasn't a press opportunity, just a debt that needed paying. Hannah noticed the difference, not the statement itself, but the absence of drama in it. No mention of her name, no attempt to use her story to soften his own. She found him a week later sitting on the same courtyard bench, now repainted, the canvas bag long gone, looking like a man who'd been waiting without wanting to admit it. "You didn't have to fix it without asking me first," she said, sitting down beside him. "I didn't want it to look like I was managing the story around you," he said. "I wanted it to actually help, whether you forgave me or not. That's a strange way to apologize." "It's the only kind I trust." He looked at her. "I'm sorry I let this become something about both of us before I asked what you actually wanted." "I wanted you to ask," she admitted. "But I also wanted you to do something, not just feel bad, so we're both a little responsible." "I can live with shared responsibility," Marcus said. "It's better odds than most board meetings give me." A passing resident balancing a tray from the new cafe gave them both a curious glance before continuing on without comment, as if two people quietly working things out on a courtyard bench had simply become part of the block's ordinary scenery again. She laughed despite herself, the tightness in her chest finally easing. It was, she thought, a small thing to laugh about on a bench outside a building that had nearly broken her. It was also, somehow, exactly enough. 7 months later, the story had mostly faded into newer headlines belonging to other companies and other people. Cornerstone Shelter had a new director, a resident advisory board with actual authority and bed counts that finally matched reality. Hannah's title was Director of Community Programs, a role that now came with a real budget and, more importantly, real say in how that budget got spent. Ben had taken to introducing Marcus at school events as "my mom's friend who used to live on a bench," a description Marcus never once corrected, even when it earned him a few confused looks from other parents. Jenny, who had eventually moved over from the bakery to manage the shelter's small donation cafe once it reopened, liked to remind anyone who'd listen that she'd called the whole thing before either of them admitted it out loud. Greg, last anyone heard, was managing a different bakery across town, where presumably the inventory was tracked with the same suspicious diligence he'd once applied to Hannah's generosity. On a shelf in Hannah's new office sat a small, slightly creased paper bakery bag, the same kind she'd handed him that very first evening, kept flat and folded as carefully as a more expensive keepsake. "You kept that?" Marcus asked one afternoon, noticing it properly for the first time. "Of course I kept it," Hannah said. "That's the bag that actually started this. Everything else just caught up to it eventually." Before we close this one, it's worth sitting with something simple. Hannah didn't help Marcus because she suspected who he really was. She helped him because in that moment, he was just a man who hadn't eaten, and that was reason enough. Real kindness usually looks exactly like that. Quiet, unglamorous, and offered without any guarantee it will ever be noticed, let alone returned. It's also worth remembering that for most people sitting on a bench like that one, there's no shelter audit waiting to change everything, no return to a boardroom once the story ends. Real homelessness rarely comes with an exit date, which is exactly why the system's meant to help. The ones with names like Cornerstone, with donors and newsletters and glossy annual reports, have to actually work, audited or not, watched or not. A story like this one can entertain, but the people it's loosely inspired by deserve more than entertainment. They deserve systems that don't need a billionaire on a bench to finally function properly. So here's a question worth sitting with. If the next person you helped never told you who they really were, would you have helped them anyway? And if you've ever felt like the person everyone else walked past without seeing, what's one small kindness that reminded you that you still mattered? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if stories about quiet kindness, accountability, and people finally being seen for who they really are mean something to you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Silver Narrative for more stories like Hannah and Marcus's. Until next time, remember that the people we walk past every day are rarely as small as the world makes them look.